Dear colleagues, I think we're all here, so let's start. We really don't have much time and a fascinating group of people, so let's not waste any more. I'll speak Russian for the session, but I can speak either Russian or English, so I might switch in the meantime. But yeah, let me introduce the session to the audience. Дорогие друзья, мы будем начинать эту сессию.
Dear friends, let us start with the session. Thank you for joining us today, and I think we have amazing experts at this table. Unfortunately, we don't have much time, so let's start immediately. Well, first of all, let me introduce our experts, and then for just 1 minute, I'll formulate what the session will be about, and we will proceed. So, the session is called City-State. Do modern megacities need national infrastructure? Our experts, that is me, Dmitry Sivaev. I'm a World Bank expert in urban development. Let me first introduce our panelists, our headliners. Headliner Saskia Sassen, she needs no introduction. She's a professor of sociology at Robert Lind, Columbia University. She's author of many books that have shaped our understanding of how globalization works and how urban development works. We also do have here Gabriele Lanfranchi, Director Cities Program at the Center for Implementation of Public Policies Promoting Equity and Growth, founder of Metro Lab initiative at MIT. We also have a guest from Japan, Hiro Ichikawa, Professor, Executive Director at Mori Memorial Foundation. We also enjoy the presence of a South African guest, Philip Harrison, who is the Research Chair in Development Planning and Modeling at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Our Russian experts are Vladimir Klimanov, head of the Department of State Regulation of Economics at ANEPA, and Evgeny Trusov, Deputy Head of Infrastructure Capital and Project Finance at VTB Capital. We also have a member of the private sector, private business, one of the largest infrastructural enterprises in the world, Suez, the CEO, Jean-Louis Chaussade. Thank you so much for being here today, for finding time to participate in the forum. Just in a couple of words, let me formulate the question that we will be trying to answer. And I will immediately refer to Saskia's book. In her papers, well, the most relevant books for me, Global Cities and Cities in Global Economy. Well, one of the topics she raises is the increasing impact of global cities in contemporary economical systems, as well as changing infrastructural needs of major cities as a response to the changing structure of the global economy. The way this contradiction works between the changing needs of global cities and sometimes the political climate of the country or political trends or the reticence of the government to invest in the infrastructure, well, those contradictions manifest themselves more and more in many countries. I lived in London for a while, and there were a lot of arguments whether it is worth investing to invest in the transportation infrastructure or to find other ways to invest. So the question remains open. I would like to hear from you some ideas about what is the state of the argument today, what are the most relevant points, what are the major needs of megacities and countries. We will start by Saskia's presentation. She always has quite an unexpected point of view, and I hope that she will set the framework for our discussion, set the tune, and after that we will hear some suggestions from our international experts. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and I think I'm a bit off the radar in terms of the subject. My specialization is not infrastructure per se. However, I am very interested in the infrastructural. So let me put on the table a bit of a provocation, and that is that if you look at our major cities, I don't know about small cities, if we look at our major cities, I would argue that the infrastructural now includes much more than just underground water systems, roads, etc. I think much of the built environment in our major cities is underused, and one has to ask the question, why is it there? Now, I wanted to share with you some data that is rather striking. I am looking at the top 100 cities in the world that are the objects of buying buildings, not necessarily to use them in any significant way. Many of them stand empty. And so at that point, the question for me is, what am I looking at? And it seems to me that one of the issues that I'm looking at is this transformation of much of the built environment into a sort of infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I mean something that is necessary but indeterminate. How it gets used is the question. So train tracks, you can use train tracks to have trains that carry bombs or that carry food for poor people, right? These buildings are so underused that one question one must ask is, what is the utility function of these buildings? And I'm not sure that they're working as buildings. I think they're working as ways to capture parts of urban space in cities, and again, the top 100 cities, and then let's see what happens with them. Now, it's an ironic take, and by no means is this framing the conversation, because I know that everybody else is just more normal and will address the question of. Now here, I wanted to, these are some of the data from where we can pass that. Oh. There we go. So this is part of the list. These are the top 100 cities. I mean, you have only 10 here. It would take the whole space. And this is just buying property, not building property. This is just 1 year. So the top 100 were $600 billion, and they're all over the world, these cities. Here you have New York, number one. They love being number one there. 55 billion in, etc. And so it goes down the list. Now, when you look at foreign capital, London is number one. And just to give you, and this also, it's a new way of understanding the notion of infrastructure. So the Qatari royals, and nothing against them, they are controversial, I know, but again, I repeat, nothing against them. The Qatari royals now own more of central London in terms of buildings than the Queen of England. I mean, I find that both very entertaining, very stimulating, and sort of amusing. The main owner is, of course, the Duke of Westminster, who has had a life of 800 years in diverse incarnations. Now, if you look at the total of the 100 cities, I repeat, in that mid-13 to mid-14, $600 billion buying property, most property are empty. This past year, it went up to over $1 trillion, $1.3 trillion. I repeat, only existing property is being bought. Now, those top 100 cities account for 10% of the world's population, 30% of the world's GDP, and 70% of property investment. Now that property investment is the financializing of those buildings. That is not simply the building. So what we have right now, and so I am interested in those who work on infrastructure, how do you describe this? So there is the building, which can be bought, and then there is a financialized set of instruments that represents the building that can be bought, sold, several times in a day, so to speak. That value that I'm going to show you, about that 70% is financialized. So it's not the buildings per se, but it is about the building. Now, okay, where do I have to point for this to move? Sorry. Okay, it's a bit slow. So, according to Savills, if you take all the buildings that are functioning both as building and in the financialized sector, that is the value. 217 trillion. That is more than the global GDP of all the countries in the world. What are we looking at here? I think we need to ask these questions. Now here comes, this is 65,000 buildings in the London area, and they are all owned by shell companies. We don't know who they are. They are mostly underused, and these shell companies are all abroad. De facto, that is a built environment that becomes infrastructural. I'm provoking. I want to repeat, this is not formal knowledge about infrastructure. I'm just pushing the limits of the meaning here. But we need to interrogate, what are we looking at when we see all of these? Now, these... Move. Hello. Okay. This is one example. This is new construction. Those few lights are almost imaginary. There's almost nobody in that building. And we have a whole set of such buildings where I'm not sure where I have to point. In the past, this one worked. Okay, this is another one. We have building after building. Same thing in London. You have a lot of empty buildings, and you can say that for a bunch of other cities. So this is an emptiness. This is density, built density, that actually de-urbanizes urban space. You understand what I'm saying, right? It may be a very tall building, it could contain a lot of people, but if it's empty, it de-urbanizes. So, and I think I had, I wish somebody would have told me. I guess that was,
Sorry,
yes. Well, we have to go back now. There was one slide that I wanted to show at the end as a provocation. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. I want to leave you with this image. So these are two rising formats. I clearly jumped over a lot of stuff. One of them is a vast word in Spanish we call la periferia, which includes both sometimes legalized housing and sometimes not. There is not much, as we would say, formal infrastructural development there. And then in the back are these, you know, these high-rise buildings. When you look at the world map through a satellite imagery, it looks like there is a lot of empty space. There isn't. Most of it is bought. Most of it is being exploited in ways like grabbing water from the Nestle's, the Coca-Colas, new plantation economies that look green, but they're killing the land, unlike smallholders, which keep land alive, etc., etc. In other words, this, in many ways, will capture an urban future. At the top, the latest innovations, etc., but often underused buildings. So what are these buildings doing there? And then the other, an overcrowded zone. I think these are types of questions that I would love to put on the agenda of people who actually work on infrastructure. The infrastructural is becoming extraordinarily important, but it includes much more than, you know, water pipes and all of that, and transport. And I think it raises a set of new questions. So I want to leave you with this image of the infrastructure role, I think an expanding category that includes more and more, versus, you know, infrastructure as the familiar term. And thank you. I did just in time. I'm very impressed with myself. I usually talk more. So thank you very much for your attention.
Fantastic, yeah. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Я кратко подведу итог.
Okay, let me sum it up briefly. Thank you for a brilliant provocation, and let me try to somehow sum up what Ms. Sasson told us about. It seems to me that the key point of whether we should invest into the national infrastructure or not, we should clearly understand which processes will lead to continue thanks to those investments. And the result of that investment is creating of some investing assets, which in fact do not make cities what we initially aim them at. They do not create the cities that are meant for prospering for innovations and all other goals that we usually associate with. It seems So the main question is, does development create and investment create in just more additional investment assets, or do investments actually make cities better? Let me pass the floor to the next guest, Gabriel Lafranchi.
The clicker. And colleagues, 5 minutes, please. Strict.
Okay. Well, I will try to focus in something that is sort of related with Saskia's proposal, which is integrated development. So how can we link the idea of infrastructure to another way of understanding the environment and the territory? It's not working again. Here. Well, we know that metro areas are growing very fast and gaining deep power everywhere in the world. This slide from Pedro Ortiz shows us how 46, if we compare nations to metro areas, we have 46 metro areas in the top 100 list. So they're really gaining a lot of power. And they are facing the most challenging that we are facing are metropolitan, inequality, resiliency, new technologies. None of them recognize frontiers. So when we talk about infrastructure, we have to think the relationship between national governments, metropolitan areas, and local governments in order to understand that we are working with an urban complex system. There is an image from Buenos Aires metro area where I work, and that's the urban DNA that I explained yesterday. And we can see how the lack of infrastructure tends to create a city that is dual, that is not equal for all. So it's very important to develop infrastructure in order to create a better environment and a better urban system. This is not working, so I think I'm going to leave it, otherwise I will lose my time. Okay, so the point is, how can we think in an integral way? What's the difference? So the approach, first thing, we need to think in other categories. We cannot keep on thinking in silo thinking to solve integrated problems. At MIT, what we developed basically is, there we go. At MIT, what we are trying to understand is what metropolitanism is actually a cultural project. It's not just a problem of technology, it's not a problem of method or political support. It's a way how we frame, how we understand the subject. And that's something very important to me, and that's why we are going in that direction. We need to move from silo thinking to categories such as environment, wealth, community, and also governance, that are, all of them are transversal and are they have different approaches. And if we think about infrastructure, same thing. We have 4 different sorts of infrastructure. I would say the gray infrastructure, which is linked to the productivity. So we have mobility, fabrics, industrial areas. We have blue infrastructure, which is linked to the management of water, but not only drinkable water and sewage, but also the water that avoids us having floodings and that makes cities more resilient. We have green infrastructure that gives us all the sustainable services, environmental services, good for the health of a city and the biodiversity. And finally, white infrastructure, which is linked to knowledge, to technology, to innovation. So I try to bring here some examples from Buenos Aires. I was asked to show some of them. So I have one from gray infrastructure. It's the big development of the BRT. And as you can see, it has different impacts in environment, in community, in wealth. Not so much in governance, because they didn't change the way the system was organized. We have also blue infrastructure. We have a huge investment, financed actually by the World Bank, on creating sewage for all. Only 55% of the population in Buenos Aires metro region has access to this, and now we are going to face really big investments in that source. We have a basic management plan, which is very innovative also. And here we're working on the governance, because we have to lead with 14 different municipalities on how to solve the problem of Riachuelo River, which is being polluted for many years, and how can we convert that into a green area for the city. And finally, innovation parks. We are seeing now a new innovation park on one part of the city that will bring together all the tech companies, and also creating a green corridor within it, and also bring us this idea of what Saskia was proposing before. We hope those buildings will be full of people working and not will become just real estate. So that's, I think, some of the challenges that we are seeing in Buenos Aires related to infrastructure and investment. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriel, for keeping on time. Опять-таки, потрясающе.
It is. Let me again just sum up the main results of what Gabriel told us about. It is crucially important to understand what the goal is, what is our aim, and what are the problems to be solved by innovating and renovating the infrastructure. What is the proper attitude, and how should we choose the industrial projects, and in order to understand the flow of city development. Let me pass the floor to the next speaker, Hiro Ichikawa. I hope that he will manage to let us dive into the national environment. Mr. Ichikawa, please tell us about your experience.
Role of infrastructure. So I just about 5 minutes to talk about the Japanese governmental policy about national land development. First important topic is regionally balanced development. This is our principle when we started the National Comprehensive Development Plan in 1962. After that, 2 years later, the first bullet train, it's a rapid railway, is connected from Tokyo to Osaka, only 3 hours for 500 kilometers. After that, this network is expanded to all over the country. And finally, maybe we could have a good position to make a balanced development until 1980s. But after 1980s, we had a quite long recession, because the bubble economy bursted. After that, so many remote areas started descending. Further, the case of Osaka. Osaka was connected to Tokyo, but after that, 20 years, some of Osaka's function was just absorbed by Tokyo. It's called the straw effect happened. So after that, anyway, from the viewpoint of role of infrastructure, now in Japan, our population is already starting declining after 2011. So, okay, we had effect of straw between Tokyo and Osaka was descending. But now already our country, we have a new phase of the aging society and decrease of population. So now we found and finding the important topic of new role of infrastructure. In this kind of, the country of aging and decrease of population, infrastructure will make new phase, because now in next 10 years now, by 2027, we have a new bullet train. It's called the maglev train. It's running faster than the ordinary bullet train. It's running 500 kilometers per hour. So finally, Tokyo and Nagoya is connected only by this new bullet train, 40 minutes. So, of course, the distance is very important for urban planning. But we should know now, we have a different idea of the distance. the viewpoint of shortening the time. So Tokyo is already a very important engine of our Japan now. Our region in Tokyo has 37 million. It's the biggest in the world. But in the next 10 years, Tokyo will include Nagoya. Finally, we have a metropolitan area. The population would be about 5 million. So we understand the national policy now is, okay, population decreasing. What's next? The keyword is compact. Compact city, compact country. So we may have some, maybe not much, but some important poles in our countries. But between these important poles, it should be connected by rapid railway rather than highway. And we may manage this kind of country to the future. So this importance of infrastructure, furthermore important for us now. This is our policy now in Japan. Thank you so much.
Can I ask you a quick clarification? So the motivation behind this, and what is the key motivation between this linking up of different locations in the country in the context of declining population? Is it economic? Is it social? What do you think it enables, first of all?
Well, actually, the most important engine in the Tokyo region now, other areas are losing power to make a new industry now. So finally, we have to concentrate more. At the same time, but connect to the remote areas, because they are descending. But whenever they have a connection to Tokyo, it's easy to get anything. And another point I have to say now is, our country's most important topic now is vacancy of housing. More than 10% are vacant in Japan now. So we have no topic about affordable housing. Whenever I have a meeting in London, New York, affordable housing, what's that for Tokyo? We have vacancy. It's a new phases now. It's more than an infrastructure topic now.
For different reasons, funny enough.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hiro. Я думаю, что всегда потрясающе интересно.
It's always so interesting to find out more about the Japanese experience, because it's so different, it's so amazing and different from the other countries' experience. Still, Heroes managed to show that difference and about the national infrastructure and its interconnectivity with other regions. Let me pass the floor to Philip Harrison, who is going to tell us more about the interconnection between the city and regional infrastructure in South Africa.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about infrastructure of national importance, of a national scale in relation to a really big spatial dilemma. The question of whether to concentrate development to achieve the benefits of agglomeration or to disperse development for greater balance and equity is an enduring and contentious one. I've been traveling around the BRICS countries, and every single country, we can debate China, but every single country is struggling, Russia included, my own country included, is struggling to develop a coherent regional policy because spatial interests are pulling in quite opposite directions. Under apartheid rule in South Africa, there was an attempt to disperse development, but that wasn't because of spatial equity, it was to keep black people out of cities. In the post-apartheid era, the question of concentration or dispersal is really unresolved. In the early 2000s, there was a strategy that said, let's concentrate development in places of real potential, which tend to be the metropolitan areas. It was approved by cabinet, but it was ignored in practice because it went against spatial interests. Currently, as we'll see, there's a national infrastructure plan, there's a pendulum swing. It tries to disperse development evenly across the country without concentration. In fact, after apartheid, when restrictions on movement have been removed, there's been greater concentration in the country, greater economic and population concentration. If I can get the slides to work. No, it's too tricky. You have to imagine them.
You have to.
Okay, maybe if you can. Okay. Our word. I don't want to take time, but I would like to show you.
Point somewhere in the back there.
Okay. So there's been greater concentration, if I can get the map. That shows the concentration. Let me just move on to... lost it again. If I can get back to that map, at least one map.
This one.
Yeah, you can see the red is the concentration. So the red in the center of the country, Johannesburg, Pretoria, nearly 40% of the economy is focused in the Gauteng city region. Is that good or bad for the country? Is it over-concentrated or not in terms of the long-term development? It's really contentious. One debate is really around national cohesion. How can you build a nation if everything is so focused in one place? And spatial equity. The other argument is we've got 30% unemployment. We have to invest in a targeted way in places where we can really maximize our return. And that's the red blob. That's the Gauteng city region. So, and the debate swings to and fro. We have a national infrastructure plan. We have a national infrastructure act. We have 18 major infrastructure projects, special infrastructure projects of every kind in the country. I won't try and show the map, but essentially the spatial logic behind that plan is one big project per province, at least one big project per province. So there's a political rationale. You're trying to build the nation. Let's give everyone something. And one can understand the political rationale. But is it viable? Is it possible? Are we really, at our stage of development, with our resources, our thin resources, are we going to be able to catalyze anything? And we have a fairly sophisticated institutional infrastructure. The president chairs the Presidential Infrastructure Commission. It has a lot of powers. So institutionally, we've got it. But what about the spatial logic? And this is the real change. How do you, and I might argue for agglomerations, and I do argue for agglomerations, but we have to understand a political reality as well. So how do we break out of this binary to concentrate or to deconcentrate? We might argue, really, let's look at connectivity rather than concentration or deconcentration. That's one way to do it. Yes, that's what I've heard in terms of Japan. But I've just been in China, and let me just conclude with this. And maybe there's a temporal dimension. So whether it was deliberate or not, Deng Xiaoping in the reform era in China, you'll remember that he started by really targeting investment, concentrating investment in the special economic zone. We've seen the dramatic images of Shenzhen this morning, and then Pudong in Shanghai in the 1990s. And once that development was catalyzed and he unleashed the productive potential of China in the 2000s, the subsequent leaders of China adopted a policy, the Go West policy, which was about to connectivity and distribute some of the benefits of that growth into the interior through a network of agglomerations. So for me, this is quite instructive. It's a very, very different context to South Africa. And so the question really is, at our stage of development, can we afford to disperse in the way that our national infrastructure plan is suggesting? Should we not try and catalyze growth through the benefits of agglomeration? But we can't stop there, because we have to build a nation. And we have to understand the political rationale. And we need, instead of provoking the reaction that concentration provokes, the negative reaction, if one can build an understanding that spatial equity and social equity are not the same thing. And that really what we're trying to address is social equity. We're trying to address the 30% unemployment crisis in our country. And to address that crisis of unemployment, we may need to spatially concentrate for a period at least. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Philip. Мне кажется, Philip очень...
I think Philip returned us to the main topic of our discussion. So, and I really understand what he's talking about. It's an eternal problem. Concentrate or deconcentrate. And there is a lack of understanding of the gap between the economic activity concentration and also providing certain standards of life levels regardless of where people live. So this binary opposition remains not understood by many governments in the world. And I think we will now move to our Russian experience. And I will ask a number of questions to Evgeny Trusov. Could you please comment and help us understand what is the Russian situation in terms of priorities in infrastructural investment in major cities? And what is the link between the needs and solutions to those needs, regional and national, well, within that logic that we are discussing now?
Да, спасибо.
Well, thank you, dear colleagues. I would like to thank the organizers for making this event real and for inviting me, because, well, I'm not a representative I'm not an expert in development, be it global or national city entities. Well, I represent a financial organization that works a lot in our country with developing infrastructure, investing in infrastructural objects. And this is an investment asset that allows us to carry out our tasks as a bank group, and on the other hand, to cater to those needs that we see around us. That information we receive from the government, from the executive branch of the government, that defines priorities, the needs and tasks for infrastructural development in major, medium and minor cities across the country. So my point is, well, while preparing for this talk, I have looked at one of the last researches made by Russian experts that gathered information about entrepreneurs in major cities with population more than 1 million people. What are their goals in terms of quality and the state of infrastructure and further development of their business activities there. So the most relevance, 80% of relevance, they ascribe to the state of transportation infrastructure, mobility, access of transport, well, people commuting and cargo transportation. You know that transport infrastructure has always reflected the solutions that were made, decisions that were made many years ago in terms of logistics, logistic principles, etc., and territorial development too. Well, our country now lives with the infrastructure that was created in a different economy, in a transport economy. Well, you know it. The way how cargo is transported and how people commute in terms of the economy needs, well, it's different. The needs are different from those that have been in place when the infrastructure was planned. So basically, in all of the major city agglomerations, urban agglomerations in Russia, there is a number of similar bottlenecks that have to do with transportation, and that have to do mostly with the fact that cargo flows stay within the agglomerations, that are not taking out of their boundaries in order to relieve the stress from the city infrastructure, in terms, I mean, heavy cargo flows on the one hand. But on the other hand, we also see that many cities have a street network and road network that services both the movement within the city and also the intercity movement. Well, you see, major roads, high-speed roads were designed to pass through the city, through the cities. And that is why we see in major cities and in regional centers too, we see a need for detours around the cities, high-speed connectivity between cities and towns that are lacking now. We also need additional passenger capacity and cargo capacity, and to cater to those needs, we invest and make our decisions. Our biggest project by now is an intercity paid road that has been built in St. Petersburg, commercial road, that was designed to solve a number of issues. To connect different neighborhoods between one another in St. Petersburg. You know, there is Vasilievsky Island that was not connected in any way. I mean, with fast movement roads with other neighborhoods on the one hand. But on the other hand, all passenger flows from the seaport, all cargo flows from seaport were also representing an additional stress on the city roads infrastructure. So now we have relieved that stress, reduced those cargo and passenger flows with our high-speed road that we built. And that was a public-private partnership that amounted to 200 billion rubles over 7 years. For us, for investors, that this was an opportunity, and for other investors too, who work in our country, I mean, we saw that opportunity with the adoption of certain legislative measures and foundations. I mean that there was a legal framework specifically designed for public-private partnership, and there was also a law on concessions or license to operate adopted before we could actually start. So yes, those instruments were in place in Europe, in US, in Asia long before we had them. We started our work 10 years ago, and the business that I represent in VTB Group marks our 10th anniversary today. And over this period, we have proved that all those models that are successfully implemented abroad can work in our country too. So those are the models that we have used to invest dozens of billions of rubles into such projects, both in St. Petersburg and in a number of Russian regions. And we also are planning to invest or to start major projects in other regions. I mean transportation. So we will be funding such projects, we'll be funding paid roads or pedestrian crossings. Well, I suppose in our country you might say that there is a need, or most regions require centralized decisions, and we need federal government support because those projects are really expensive. And we know that apart from Moscow and St. Petersburg, all the rest of the regions, when they implement projects that cost more than 50 billion rubles, cannot do that on their own without some kind of additional support from the federal center. Well, those richer territories, major megalopolises, Moscow and St. Petersburg, I mean, can do that on their own, through their own resources, and Moscow shows it, with minimal participation of private investment or under PPP models that we are so happy with, at least in St. Petersburg. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Evgeny. Let me directly pass the microphone to Vladimir Klimanov. Let me rephrase one of your comments. Evgeny mentioned two main challenges of the Russian infrastructure. The first one is adapting to the new Russian infrastructure and reality, and the second, and somehow make it interrelate with the economic relationship and national hierarchy. How do you see the infrastructural challenge in Russia today? So if we're talking about centralization or decentralization, what are your thoughts about that? Thank you so much. I completely agree with the idea that in Russia, until lately, there are two main cities which Saskia would call global cities, but during the last 10 years we've made a really breakthrough. Even in the terms of mega projects implementing, many cities apart from from Moscow and St. Petersburg can be called global now. Think about Kazan, which hosted the summer students' games, sport games, and which enabled the city to become more comfortable not only for hosting other foreign guests but also for living. Think about Vladivostok City, which hosted another event related to the big events when of meeting with the heads of the Asian Pacific region heads. Think of the huge projects of building the large scale, the big bridges that interconnected the center of the city with other neighborhoods. Think about Sochi, which hosted the Winter Olympics. We expect that more Russian cities will join the top list of the global cities after the World Cup of 2018. We are talking about the we are looking at the retrospective of implementing some infrastructural projects, transport infrastructure development, creating new social infrastructure objects. More passage streets are being created, which could be rarely seen in most of the cities. So this is how it is becoming more and more interesting. Probably Moscow has lost some of its attractiveness, since there are more cities now in Russia which became more attractive for living in those cities. However, in fact, according to the data, to the statistics, population concentration in Moscow is even more tightening, and since the GDP ratio in Moscow is still huge, if we look at the investment statistics or the investment statistics, Moscow rating will be probably even higher than in terms of the population or the GNP. So whether the concentration will continue or will it stop due to the other cities becoming more attractive, this is exactly the challenge that we are going to face in Russia. We need to somehow understand it and try to adapt into the newly formed up environment. This is how we should somehow fit the inner city, the internal infrastructure which is existing now, with building the high-speed railways and implementing some other infrastructural transport projects, enabling these cities to become the group of the cities, or the major cities, which we expect to take place in the nearest future. Thank you, Vladimir. Let me address to Jean-Louis as a representative of one of the biggest infrastructural companies of the world. We've heard today with the provocational approach of Saskia. We've heard about the Japanese and Russian experience. You're also engaged into major infrastructural projects. What are the main projects that you are aiming now, that you are busy with? What are you trying to achieve? Concentration or deconcentration? So what is your attitude towards these things?
what we are doing in Suez. So Suez, it's an environmental company involved in services, water management, waste management, energy savings. And when we look to the cities, we believe that the next frontiers is not only the extent of new infrastructures, but it's also, as you mentioned, a much better use of the existing one. And why do we believe so? Because if we have in mind that, let's say in 20 years' time, we will be 9-something billion on Earth, 2/3 of the world population will be living in cities, and 600 cities worldwide will concentrate probably 2/3 or 3/4 of the world population, and the same in terms of GDP. If we believe that the way we have been doing infrastructure in the past is the one we can imagine for the future, we are, in my view, totally wrong. One of the major issues we have to face when we are looking to infrastructure is if you want to be an attractive city, if you want to attract talent, you have to offer different cities. Because the cities will be in the future in competitions. Today, I am French, but Paris is in competition with London, no doubt on that. And you know, you can work in Paris and live in London, or you can live in London and work in Paris. It's so easy today. So what are going to be the reason why you are going to select one city or another one? I think it's because you will feel better, you will have better services in one city than another one. So what is going to be, if I can say, the answer to these questions? One major thinking we have in Suez is the fact that a city, the big cities, cannot continue to be only consumers of goods, of foods, of energy, of electricity, of water. Cities cannot continue to have more cars, cannot produce more CO2s. Therefore, if I can summarize my visions, the cities need to be more what I call resourceful cities. Part of the resources the cities are consuming should come from the cities. It means that you have to recycle. It means that the city must be much more circular economy oriented than they are today. It's impossible to imagine that we are going to continue to grow at the same speed worldwide, 3.5%, 4%, and continue to grow the amount of resources we need at the same speed. I think the growth can continue, but we have to pay attention to the resources, which means that we have to slow down. And to slow down the consumption of resources, of raw materials, of foods, you need to recycle more, you need to use less, and therefore the use of the existing infrastructures, or even the use of the new infrastructures, they have to be much stronger, much better than it is today. So how can we achieve that? I think that it's a combination of a new way of doing things. Transportation, you have to imagine that you will have less and less individual car and more common transportations. But in the meantime, you certainly need to use more data. And I think that smart cities and using data are linked, totally linked. I mean that you have to put together the city, the infrastructures, the citizens, and of course the services, in order to make all them working together. We have some experience actually in Singapore or even in France, where progressively we are working together the security network with the transportation network, with water network, with waste transportation, because if you try to work that all together, you will find a better way to organize the city and to be able to have more people living, if I can say, in the best possible conditions, or even in attractive conditions, without having a concentration such that at the end of the day, you have a risk, in my view, of collapsing part of the cities, because they will be unable to sustain what the populations wants and needs. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jean-Louis. Let me quickly summarize and maybe ask one more question. So I'll do it in English if everybody doesn't mind, so I can engage the panel. So I think, as always in these sessions, we rose fascinating questions, maybe didn't find answers. And I think I can summarize it there too. First one is the question of when we make this decision about urban infrastructure versus national infrastructure, what drives this decision? What is our motivation? When we invest in cities and agglomerations, do we do it to enable better cities that are more productive and create better conditions for people to live in? Or do we do it to allow for value capture through people who, use shell companies and don't reveal their identities? Do we make cities that accommodate greater consumption? Or do we make cities that are more efficient? When we think of national infrastructure, do we prioritize national infrastructure to achieve integration, as in Japan, or to achieve deconcentration, as in South Africa, or to promote secondary centers, as in Russia, or to adapt to evolving economy or needs of the economy, as our other speaker said about Russia? And the second big question I think that we rose is, how do we decide? How do we think about infrastructure? Do we engage in deep process of identifying infrastructure needs, like MIT urges us to do? Do we utilize the infrastructure that's there, or do we always aim to build new? And finally, do we engage people, and do we try to go through inclusive processes of defining what the needs are? So we have a couple of minutes, and I wanted to turn back to Saskia, and maybe just, these are the two big questions that I've heard, but let me just hear your take on what you've learned today from this fascinating panel and diverse opinions.
Oh, big, right. So really wonderful, wonderful contributions. I would love to address all I can, so let me just focus on a couple of things which were mentioned partially. I want to, Hiro, when you said we can have densities, multiple densities, that compress time, even though physically they may be separate, if we have proper infrastructure. Well, Japan has been very good at that. I do think that that becomes important, because some of these agglomerations get out of control, and then we enter what we see in Latin America a lot, very devastated zones. So that combination of densities plus, state-of-the-art transport, to me, seems a very important one, so that nobody really feels isolated or nobody is a big word, but many of those who are in those secondary cities. Now, the other point to me that seems very important is that every building, just to look at buildings, every building should at least fit or contribute to two functions. One is whatever the reason for building the building, but the other one is that every surface in those buildings should be working with a biosphere. Now, I happen to be lucky. I am in a big university. I'm working with a lot of scientists who look at material science, which is a whole new world, and biologists who are interested in applications, on the built environment, which is a minority of all biologists, by the way. Most biologists are not interested in the environmental question. So, for instance, this notion that you can use bacteria, to cover concrete, and that eventually that bacterium begins to purify the air right around every building. So a visual map from the air would be all these concrete surfaces, whether this way or that way, are actually purifying the air right around them. That's not enough to purify a whole city, but it is. The notion that we can use brown waters, a major challenge, you know what I'm talking about, right? What we produce in kitchens, in bathrooms, major challenge for most cities because it's just growing. The fact that there is another bacterium, Copenhagen, at the University of Copenhagen and Delft, they have been working on this, that if you put it in brown waters, it eventually develops a bacterium that produces a plastic. Strong, resistant, but biodegradable. In other words, what is a negative, what is a burden that every agglomeration faces, small or big, is now an input. The city can either choose to produce the plastic or export the prime matter, so to say. Right? I mean, when you begin to think about everything in a city having at least two functions, the function for it was built, and then that other function. And you throw in some of the digital aspects and some of these other forms of knowledge, I think that we could head towards a totally different mode of understanding, how do we handle the question of urban space with the environmental question, which I think that becomes a major issue, frankly, for our future. And yeah, there's much more to be said about that, but...
Okay, I'll use the luxury of being a moderator to ask one question to everyone, and guys, you need to answer with one sentence, or preferably one word. So basically, I think the whole debate is about what should be the main priority when choosing infrastructure investment, when prioritizing infrastructure investment. What should drive those decisions? So if you were, and I know it's impossible, but let's be all provocative as Saskia was at the beginning of this session. If you were to say one main thing to consider when prioritizing infrastructure investment, what would it be? And can we just go in a circle quickly?
Today I talked about aging society. So our recent topic is aging infrastructure. Of course, private sector is important.
Speak a bit louder.
Oh, okay. Okay, today I'm talking about aging society.
Yeah.
But more important topic for us now is aging infrastructure. Of course, we need the power of private sectors.
Yeah.
But furthermore, whenever we construct something...
Okay, the rule was one sentence, so...
So aging infrastructure.
Aging. So needs of people, basically. Gabriel, one sentence.
I would say one word, planification. We need plan and action, and both at the same time, understanding that with infrastructure we can really make smart cities, we can change the world by doing both at the same thing. We cannot separate plan than...
Wait to turn one word into a paragraph. Jean-Louis.
I would say we need smart and circular solutions.
Smart and circular. Евгений, ваш вариант.
Мне кажется, очень важна гибкость при принятии решений.
Flexibility and making decisions, and decisions being agile.
Necessary and
The button.
Necessary and distributed. So whatever we need, and it just has to be for all those who need it.
Very good.
So it would be linkage and connectivity to get those job-creating economies really working in agglomerations.
Very good.
I should say in English in this case, because it seems to me the infrastructure must be for post-industrial or even for post-modern development, not for industrial one.
Okay. So,
how useful is this, forcing us with one? I'm putting you on the spot.
well, I don't know how useful it is. I think what it does, you know, we won't come with a solution here, but I think what we've achieved is to see the breadth of the subject and to see the diversity of takes that there are, and that you can approach thinking of how to prioritize infrastructure investment in very different ways.
That's true.
As I said, you know, and I think this final round also showcases that given which backgrounds we come from, if you come from Japan, if you come from South Africa, from Russia, we tend to approach those subjects differently. So I think it was a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank
and
you.
I'm sorry we don't have all...
Thank you. Thank you.
Спасибо огромное, коллеги.
Colleagues, thank you so much. I think it worked out really fine, a very beautiful panel. We couldn't manage to find out solutions to every question, but we have clarified our vision. And I also need to inform you that in 15 minutes there will be another round table planning with expiration date. Remain